Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't we get started? I would like to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the center. And it's a thrill for us to be really hosting a day's worth of activity, starting with this morning's meeting, but a day's worth of collaborations with the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Goes by the acronym PRIO. PRIO has been very kind to me personally. I've been fortunate enough to have a number of months there in residence studying and researching in a very active, lively, intellectual environment with some terrific people. Niels Petter Gleditsch, senior researcher there, or whatever title, he's got multiple titles. But Niels Petter has been terrifically helpful to me and to our program. And so it was a thrill for us to be able to collaborate on bringing some of the current research and some of the current researchers from PRIO to Washington and provide a forum for discussion of some excellent and, as usual, cutting-edge research that they're doing. So we have a session right now, and then we have another one at noon that I urge you to take advantage of as well. So let me just very briefly say a word about the Wilson Center, introduce our speakers, and turn the floor over to them. For those of you who may be new to the center, you're actually sitting at the former memorial to Woodrow Wilson. So Congress set up the Wilson Center in 1968 as a place where the worlds of scholarship and policy come together. Wilson was our only president with a PhD, and so for better or for worse. This is an opportunity for those two worlds to learn from one another, and we do that on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis. The Environmental Change and Security Program is a 13-year-old program that tries to facilitate this dialogue within the worlds of environment, development, health, population, and then broader foreign policy and security policy issues. And so, as you will see, today's topic really fits directly in that arena. We do that with meetings like this and some publications that I hope you will avail yourself of outside. We're webcasting this meeting live, so when we go to the discussion period, I hope you will tell us your name and also use a microphone that my colleagues will bring to you so the folks on the web and the archive video can share in hearing your question as well. So let's turn to the substance of the meeting. Ethical investment, energy, climate change and security, new research from Norway's PRIO. As you can see, there's quite a lot in that title, but it really reflects that there's quite a lot going on at PRIO and the work of the two gentlemen that we have to kick it off. Henrik Sousa is the head of corporate governance at Norway Bank Investment Management, which manages the Norwegian government pension fund global and the Norwegian government currency reserve, so the so-called petroleum fund. And so it's terrific that he will share his insights on ethical investment in energy and how the Norwegians have handled that abundance of resources. Henrik is also, I should hasten to ask, a senior research fellow at PRIO and someone whose office was just a door or two down from mine when I was there 10 years ago. So it's terrific to see him again. As you can see from the bio, he's trained as a philosopher, has a wide range of writings, and is someone who I very much look forward to hearing. Stein Tonneson is the director of International Peace Research Oslo. He's trained as a historian, particularly to focus on East and Southeast Asia, and so is working on, again, issues of energy, climate, and the regional context and connecting it to security. So we're very much looking forward to Stein's comments as well. So, Henrik, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, good. Jeff, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to see all of you here. I am, for the time being, 80% engaged for the Norwegian Central Bank's work on managing this petroleum fund, and 20% at PRIO. I'm not a mathematician, but I realize that 80 and 20 at least is not 100, according to my wife. But I try to keep these two parts of my life together. Most of my PRIO work is done in the evenings and during the night, so I rarely see my colleagues, so I therefore have to go all the way to Washington, D.C. to be with them. But it's good to be with you, Stein, and all my other colleagues here. It's a special delight to be in this building, since my colleague Greg and I and another colleague, Andrew Begbie, have just published a book on the ethics of war with the most significant writings through the ages on this tangled question of how can we restrain violence in war. And one of my favorite chapters, it's one that I edited, is on Woodrow Wilson. I realized we're in the Ronald Reagan building, so there should have been a Ronald Reagan chapter as well. There is not. But anyway, the book is now out on Blackwell, and it's that part of my life at PRIO. But then, of course, you may ask the question, what on earth is a moral philosopher doing helping the management of a large investment fund? And I asked myself the same question when I was asked to take on this job by the leadership at Norges Bank. I asked them, do you really know who you're talking to? I mean, I don't know the difference between stocks and bonds. That is not true. I actually do. But I tried to point out to them that you must know what sort of competence you're bringing aboard. And the answer from the CEO of the fund was, well, that's exactly the point. We have the best competence in the world on stocks and bonds. We're growing and becoming the largest pension fund in the Western world, and we recruit the best people all the time. But when we are to use our ownership rights in order to secure the long-term sustainability of this fund, maybe we need someone with another language. Maybe we need someone who looks at this from the outside and helps us ask different questions. So I was tempted, as they say in The Godfather, by an offer I really couldn't refuse. And there I am, still asking myself the question every day, why am I really here? But at least after a bit more than a year, having found part of the answer. And I'll try to share that with you. So NBIM is the acronym for Norges Bank Investment Management. Norges Bank is the Norwegian central bank, but our activity really has nothing to do with the rest of what a central bank does, interest rates, money printing, and so on. What we are is an investment management unit, accidentally, so to speak, placed there because they hope to build up a really robust competence in investment management. The fund that we are talking about was established in 1990. Actually, my father was prime minister at the time, but I knew nothing then that I would have anything to do with it. It was established by law as a device to save up the revenues from the petroleum sector, plus the state's direct income from the petroleum sector. At the time, there was no influx into the fund because everything was pretty much spent at the time, but there was an expectancy that there would be a savings here to actually take care of for the future. And the idea then is, of course, to avoid the resource curse, to avoid in an economy already very much dependent on the oil, already with a very large percentage of the GDP going through government channels, that this heats up the economy even more. So this is an attempt at putting aside all this money for the future instead of spending it now. And I guess in the back of many of your heads, there is the phrase Dutch disease. How to avoid the resource curse. How to avoid an economy being skewed, being destroyed, many would say, by this huge influx coming in. There is, however, another answer which appeals more to me. Another argument for having this fund. And that's a moral one. That's based on the idea that this resource has been built up over 100 to 300 million years, according to the geologists. We happen to live within a 70 to 90 year frame where we take this out and move it to somewhere else. But we should not all spend it at this moment. This is basically an idea that this is a common resource that we own together, and if we spend it now, we do a disservice to future generations. So we should think of ourselves not as extracting something that we spend the income from, but we are moving it from one place to another. We are moving it from offshore to a bank. And the beauty, of course, of having it in a bank is that then you can have interest rates from it. You can actually have a steady return. So that's the rule that the Norwegian government has made for itself. It's surprisingly transpolitical. It's a surprising broad agreement about this. Because, I mean, what you're essentially having here is a huge bowl of jelly on the table, and you're eating breakfast, and you're telling yourself not to use it. But that's basically what they've said. They said that we can have an annual estimated return of 4% that we can put into the economy every year. Right now, that's approximately 12 to 13 billion US dollars, and the rest we don't spend. In theory, it's there for eternity. In theory, it's there so that every generation ahead will have this basis to take the returns out from. Now, just a little bit more about the timeline. In 1996, the first capital transfer actually happened, so the fund started. Equities were added to the investment universe. non-government bonds were added to the investment universe. And we got ethical guidelines for the fund, about which I will be talking. We have assets under management now of approximately US $300 billion. So this is, depending a little bit on how you count, the largest pension fund in the Western world. It's not quite as large as TIAA-CREF, which I would imagine that some people here have their savings in. But that's because it's counted a little bit different, because they also have a mutual fund department. But it's larger than CalPERS, for instance, and larger also than the largest other pension funds in Europe. As I said, the income comes from the oil. Norway is today the 7th largest oil producer in the world. And of course, we're not many people up there, so we are the 3rd largest oil exporter. And obviously, there is a huge influx into the fund all the time. So this is a figure that will grow. There are different estimates, but we may be well above 400 billion by the end of the decade. Now, the ethics. Is it hypocritical to earn money off what some would say are destructive products, knowing that oil and gas are among the main contributors to global warming? Should we instead just keep it out there? Well, I heard a fascinating lecture a few weeks ago by the Norwegian Minister of Finance, Ms. Kristin Halvorsen, an excellent woman, who is also very straightforward. And she said that I'm mired in hypocrisy, she said. I represent a party, she's from the Socialist Party, who talks very elegantly and eloquently about the dangers of climate change. And yet I just cannot stop extracting this oil. Because here we have this welfare state that gets 13 to 14 billion US dollars every year from this. And we have customers around the world that want this oil. And if we stop extracting it, the rest of the world will cry, because that will change the whole equation. We are an important oil exporter. And she said, I just don't have the guts to stop that. But what I do have the guts to, she said, is to say that, well, then we need to take on an extra responsibility. Then we need to be an extra strong voice in questions of sustainability, in questions of combating climate change, and even using the fund and its ownership voice to do so. And that's what I'll talk about a little bit later. I realize Jeff is already nervous, since I have spent 10 minutes and I'm saying what I'll come back to later. I'm still on my introduction. I have a very long introduction, but I have a very short lecture, so it'll be okay. I can really skip the lecture. I would also like to add that what we do here often, and this is not self-praise, but this is basically what most economists and politicians around the world will say about this fund, is that it is a frugal way of managing the funds, and that very few other countries have managed to do so. Some have managed to build up these sorts of funds, but at the same time they have developed huge deficits on their state budgets, because they know they have the fund. The rule I talked about only using 4% of the actual return, also includes a rule that there must be no budget deficits in Norway while we have this fund. So it is an attempt to be frugal, it's an attempt to be responsible, and I'll come back to the responsible investment part of it. Leads me to the term corporate governance, which is what we call the active ownership of investors. I have a mother who is a very intelligent woman, but I still have a hard time explaining to her what I exactly do. Head of corporate governance is my title, and she comes, head of what? Aren't you doing something with Plato? But Plato, of course, is dead, and this is pretty much alive. Now, NBIM has guidelines for corporate governance. That is, guidelines for how we use our ownership voice in those almost 3,500 companies in which we own equities. I'm sure there are people here in this room who know this side of the economy well. Others may not know it that well, but you may not have some shares. So you may sometimes get invitations to come to annual meetings. Well, that's basically what my work is about. It's basically about using that ownership voice, but doing it as one of the largest single investors in the world. Now, when I first heard about the job, I imagined a poor fellow with 3,500 plane tickets traveling around to annual meetings to vote. Fortunately, it doesn't work that way, because we have proxy voting and electronic voting systems. When it comes to the guidelines, they are specifically based on OECD and UN Global Compact guidelines. That is actually somewhat significant, because you sometimes get, as an investor, and I know many investors in this country as well, the accusation that you are out on some sort of missionary political quest. out to change the world according to some political activist program, and that you're not really being an investor with all the responsibilities that follow from that. And therefore, it's important for us to point out that our work is based on widely shared principles that a majority of the companies that we interact with have themselves signed and themselves said that they want to live up to. So this is actually an important point. Now there are also, as I pointed out on the previous slide, separate guidelines from the Norwegian government. They are divided in two. They include the work that we do within the bank, which we started in the fall of 2005. But it also includes an exclusion mechanism. And if most of you, when you hear the word ethical investment, think of that, that is quite natural, because that is what often grabs the most attention, right? When you think of ethical investment, it's pretty much about avoiding certain things, making a stand by saying, we will not invest in this, that, or the other. In Norway, there is division of labor between our principal, or the representatives of our owner, which is the finance ministry. They tell us what we can and cannot invest in. They have a separate council on ethics, which uses a negative screen to screen out the companies that they say that we cannot accept being invested in. There's no economic argument behind it. There is no argument behind it about influencing the world. It's basically what we in philosophy call a complicity argument. The idea that through your investments, you become complicit in what that company does, even if you only own a little bit, like we do. Our average share in each company is 0.5%. Our maximum share, according to government guidelines, is 5%. Still, we do become complicit by investing our money. There are certain sorts of activities that we should not take part in. The guidelines have put the threshold high. So this is not an SRI fund, if you know that term, kind of socially responsible fund that only invests in a small part of the investment universe. But we do have an exclusion mechanism, and I'm happy, since I'm from PRIO, to state that the screen is a weapons screen, that companies that contribute to the production of illegal or grossly immoral weapons will be excluded from the investment universe. Even that one can be discussed, because what we have excluded then are companies that have contributed to the production of nuclear weapons. But we are, of course, a member of NATO and accept the NATO strategy, so you have a problem right there. And that exclusion led to, or that mechanism led to the exclusion, for instance, of Boeing, which the Norwegian government obviously is still a customer of. Anyway, I'll leave that, because that belongs to the finance ministry. I think it's a relatively well thought through screen, and as I said, it includes weapons, and it also includes gross violations of human rights and labor rights. They have so far excluded 20 companies from the investment universe, but they're working their way through the investment universe with a broom. I cannot guess how many companies it'll actually be, but I'm sure in the end we'll have a list of more than 100 companies. That's a guess. That will be excluded on the basis of these guidelines. That, however, is not my job. So if anyone here has heard that Walmart was excluded last year and you want a really fiery discussion about Walmart, I'd be happy to take part in it, but I did not make that decision. Because we're the second hurdle. We actually use the ownership rights that we have. And the reason why I mentioned Walmart is that there was quite a lot of debate about that one last year. The reason for excluding it was serious violations of labor rights in several third world countries. But we were asked at the bank what we thought. The finance minister sent us a letter and asked, what do you think? And we recommended that we wait a little bit with that exclusion, because we can use our ownership rights. Now, the finance ministry came down and concluded that we'll follow the recommendation from the finance ministry's council on ethics. We, of course, accept that. Any investor accepts what the owner, they have a right to tell us what to invest in and not to invest in. But there is a real dilemma here. If the large investors who want to take serious long-term responsibility for their ownership draw themselves out of many of the problem cases, you won't anymore have that voice there. In Walmart's case, that's not the case, because you have that voice there in abundance. Now, a cliche at the end. I also like to add a few trite things. So here's our aim is to be a responsible investor, blah, blah, blah. But, that's the term we use. It is. And I think it carries some meaning. Because responsibility for me is about two things. It's not just about responsibility in the causal sense, that you actually cause something by directly being a material cause. But it's also about the sort of signals you send. It's about the role you play. And there is no doubt that NBIM today is one of the largest investors in the world and therefore is being looked at. I realize that. I don't think most Norwegians realize that. There is more written about the activity that we do in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal than there is in the Norwegian press. Because basically we are looked to as a player and people ask, what do you do? What sort of voice do you use as an owner? Now I call the next few slides ethics, business and investment. And just want to point out one thing first, which is quite commonsensical, but I like the old philosophical motto, I think it comes from Voltaire, that says that common sense is not so common. So you sometimes have to repeat that as well. The thing is that very often the question is being asked, well, what do you want? You want the returns or you want the ethics? But the sort of fund that we are have a moral fiduciary responsibility to secure long-term returns. So in our guidelines, it's explicitly formulated as an ethical imperative to produce returns. Now, this means that it's often ethics versus ethics, basically, that we are struggling with. Let me take a simple example. A large debate in Norway has been about whether the screen should include tobacco investments. Today it does not. We are heavily invested in tobacco. I don't smoke. My 4 children are something like anti-smoke fascists. I have to calm them down. They see a smoker, it's like, no, they can be good persons. You know that. You know the sort of fervor around tobacco. But we are invested in tobacco because the guidelines say that it's a legal product. And there is not a broad enough agreement in the Norwegian public about this actually being an evil. We cannot exclude that. But then, of course, comes the additional fact that this is one of the investments that do the best. They've been very successful. And while I don't have the most current figures, a colleague of mine pointed out to me that we can well sit a few years from now and say that these investments have added 500 million Norwegian kroner to the fund. That's quite a lot of money on some future occasion when the Norwegian public could use this. And should we forego that because we say today that we should not be involved in tobacco if our investment in each company is so small and so liquid that if we left those investments, someone else would buy them? Now, as a moral philosopher, I don't like that kind of reasoning, because that's the kind of reasoning that can make someone go to a concentration camp and say it's okay that I work here, because if I don't, someone else does it instead. But of course, tobacco is not a concentration camp. Tobacco is still a legal stock, and it's a stock that makes money. And our job, according to the Norwegian government, all parties from the left to the right, is to make sure that the returns are good for the sake of future generations. So it's not an easy ethics versus money. Another point, and this is my favorite point here, so if I don't have time for the rest, at least try to remember just this one, is that we need to negotiate between different motivations. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the things that we are doing, and I'll mention it at the end, is to work on some social issues that we have picked out as especially important for a long-term investor. One of them is the fight against child labor. And when I'm out there and I'm talking to companies or I'm talking to the public about the scourge of child labor and about why I believe that we should have markets 20 years from now that don't include children in bonded labor, then obviously I see that as an ethical argument. And the question comes, aren't you an investor? Aren't you supposed to make the investment argument? But obviously that's not the way we human beings are. We have several motivations at the same time. We do things for several reasons. If you were a board of directors and I was talking to you, obviously I would both be talking about the finance case of what we're doing, and I would be talking about whether it's right or wrong in itself. And I think therefore a natural aim for our kind of organization is to find a motivational overlap, to find those issues we can be an active voice that both make sense from a long-term financial standpoint and from the point of view of ethics. This is not an easy one, but I think it's an important ambition to have. Of course, added to this is the fact that our owners increasingly expect us to include social, environmental, and also governance issues into our corporate governance activity. This means that we are supposed to raise, and we do, issues that cannot be read off the next quarterly balance sheet. They're often called extra financials. Someone asked, who put the extra in extra financial? Because why we're doing it is obviously that we believe that these are important to the markets in the long term. But this is a challenge, and I'll admit that. Because the kind of structure that this sort of pension fund has, and it's true for most of the pension funds that you are invested in as well, is that we're not really exposed to company risk, since we own very little in each company, but we are exposed to market risk. We can survive an Enron, but we cannot survive catastrophic climate change over the next 30 years. And this is, of course, a challenge when you go to communicate with each individual company, because you're essentially telling them that we need to change, not because we think you're necessarily in huge danger, but because our broad portfolio is. And trying to combine the company and the portfolio arguments is one of the greatest practical challenges and rhetorical challenges that we have. Now, the thing is, of course, that we're not alone, and that's an important point. Even though we each own small stakes in each company, altogether pension funds account for ever larger parts of the stock world, including private equity. We're not in private equities yet. We may end up there. We will at least enlarge our equity share to 60% relatively soon. But the point is that in the United States, more than 60% of the listed stock market is owned by these sorts of investors. And these are investors that ask questions about where the companies and the markets will be 20 to 30 years from now. Now, there are two main ways of doing this work. Whoops, sorry. There was supposed to be a B there at the bottom. I'll read that to you. The A is integration into investment decisions. That's not part of our mandate now. We don't have the sort of mandate where we go out and pick specifically green investments. There's a huge debate whether we should do that. But the question is, once again, the money we may lose from that, would that be better spent by being politically active on these issues? Or can we actually earn more? Which, of course, the holders of so-called green indices say. Will we be able to pick the right investments? Well, this is a huge debate, and we may come back to that. But that's not part of my work. The B that should have been there is what we do.
So it starts out on the end, the line.
Oh, that's right. There it is. Yes. Hooray. Overlay engagement. Isn't that a cool one? Overlay means pretty much that you take the portfolio as it is, and then you engage with the companies. Whether your holding is large or small, whatever kind of investment it is, you are actually an owner, and the importance of that, and this is a key point, is that then you are talking to companies as an owner who will be there in the long term. A representative of a large multinational said to me last year that you are the kind of investor that is most interesting to talk to, because we pretty much know that 10 years from now, you're still our owner. This is the sort of dynamic you can build up through long-term engagement. So let us sum up then. What are the sorts of arguments for including these sorts of extra financials? You saw ESG as the acronym on the previous slide. That stands for environment, social, and governance issues. I would at least say that there are four. First, there is a long-term solidity and functioning of the markets themselves. I've already made the argument. The fact that we actually have to think through what the markets look like. We are what is often called in the investment world a universal owner. We don't really primarily own companies, but we own a little slice of the world. And therefore, and it's the whole world. Secondly, becoming increasingly important in company dialogue is the reputational and subsequent financial damage to the companies we are invested in. Are they actually willing to have their name closely connected to child labor? It's our own reputation, the profile of our funds, what our owners expect of us. And then, as a moral philosopher, I always insist on number 4. It's right in itself. Ethics doesn't always need an instrumental added argument. So, what issues should we and do we address? And I'm getting closer to the end. About 5 more minutes, okay? Thanks. Of course, issues where we can contribute to change, once again, may seem extremely commonsensical, but there is a temptation to pick whatever is out there in the public domain and shout about it. Some of you here will know that there has been a lot of debate about CalPERS, the California Public Pension Fund. And I admire a lot what CalPERS has managed to do. They have opened a lot of doors. They were among the few to do this before Enron. They realized that these owners need to use their voice. But there has also been a huge debate about whether CalPERS has ended up as more of a political voice, pretty much saying what's in the majority of the California legislature and going out there and talking loudly about it, rather than actually picking out the things where investors can contribute to change. I wouldn't say it's true of CalPERS, but I see it's a real discussion, especially for us who are politically owned and have a finance minister behind us who wants to be happy, understandably. With a father who was a politician, I like making politicians happy. But that's not the job of an investor. That's not what we're there to do. Leads us to the second point. We must pick issues that do not make us spend our reputational resource as an investor. What do I mean by that? Well, last week an NGO suggested to us that NBIM should raise shareholder resolutions at every single company we own that has anything to do with production of greenhouse gases. Meaning essentially that we would send out hundreds of shareholder resolutions. Sounds like a good idea, right? You're there. You're being heard. Well, I can promise you, while I have a lot of respect for the NGO suggesting that you would lose your voice as an investor very quickly, because you would be seen as a political actor, not as an investment actor, and as a nuisance. That's just the way the world is, and that's a division of labor that we have. We need issues where we can work with other investors, obviously because our stakes are small in each company. We need issues that are linked to recognized norms. I already made that argument with UN Global Compact. And we need issues that actually have long-term impact. That's back to the change point, really. We need those issues where we actually see that what we and the businesses together do today are changing the world. There are several examples from the last few years of concrete successes of corporate governance work. And I would say that one of the foremost is coming in this country, where because of investor activism, the whole structure of how boards of directors are nominated and elected in this country is changing. We are actually gaining a voice for investors to actually be able to suggest nominees for boards. That may sound obvious. Aren't shareholders supposed to do that? Well, for 20 years, that's not been the case in the United States, where pretty much you've had a CEO-ruled board, and where there has been very little scope for investors to make their voice heard. This is an immensely important issue where we are making headway these days. Mark Anson, the former CEO of CalPERS, has this top 10 list of stupid things he's heard from CEOs, and there are many absolutely excellent CEOs in this country, so this is not meant by him nor by me as a general condemnation, but one of his favorites is one, so you actually mean that shareholders are supposed to elect the boards? Well, that's actually what we mean. Another one he had was, well, this board member is not a friend of mine, it's my brother-in-law. So let's finish off with the strategy that we have presented just last week. We have picked out certain points that we will be working on, that will be our strategic issues, that we'll be working on for the next 10 to 20 years if necessary. The boring ones from a moral philosophy point of view are the corporate governance things, such as the nomination board of directors, immensely important to make the system work, but still more instrumental. We are working, however, on issues of child labor and children's rights, where we see just in a country such as India more than 3 million children who are working as bonded, more or less bonded child labor, and where it's fully possible for multinationals to contribute to an end to that. They need a push. They need someone to insist, and the closest voice to doing that is the one of investors. We have picked it because we're the sort of long-term investor we are, and because we believe that most investors haven't been willing to look at just these issues closely enough. And the other one is the one that brings a bridge to Stein's presentation, and that's about long-term environmental change and global warming. And I'll just spend the last 2 minutes on that. Many investors are talking about this. We are as well. We are saying that we need responsibility from the gas and petroleum producers, including those operating in Norway, in order to make sure that we actually create better and more sustainable policies. But the point is, of course, that it's not the companies that can change this. It's better government regulation. International government regulation. That's basically the sort of standards, what will come after the Kyoto Protocol. What sort of emission limits will there be? When will the United States come on board? These are the crucial issues. And the question is, what can an investor do about that? Well, we have found an angle that we believe is very important and so far very much underutilized by investors, namely to insist on more openness about the lobbying. A lot of our portfolio companies spend considerable time and resources lobbying against the interest of many of their main investors, including ourselves. And we need to see a change to that by shedding more light on that issue. It's important to note that these must not be flavors of the month. These must not be things we do right now but then forget a few months from now, but must be consistent engagement based on clear message. The last one is once again just a boring one, so I'll just go quickly through that like this. This is what we do. This is what we spend our time with. And bullet point number 5 is what I'm doing right now. And then, as an honor to all of you philosophers here, I finish off with Immanuel Kant. Ought implies can. If you say that you ought to do something, it must also mean that you can do it, that there's a possibility. And I think we see that investors like this can make a real change because they have power, and the power can be used rightly. We try to do our best. Thank you.
Terrific. I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
Let me start by thanking Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and Geoff Tabelco in particular for hosting this event today. We at PRIO are happy and proud to be here. If ought means can, then what I'm talking about is more like must means can with a question mark. I'll take you through an attempt at a very global general political argument concerning climate change, energy security and instability in the Middle East, with focus on Asia, but with less focus on Asia than I had thought I would have when I started. My main argument is that global warming forms a challenge with the potential for uniting the world behind a common purpose. This at a time where certain events and particular policies pursued by the present American administration have led to a situation with a weakened role for the United States and with more dissension and tension among the great powers. Here you see a potential for a resurrection of international cooperation and also of US direct participation in multilateral work and US leadership. The presidential campaign that you have started will play a major role in preparing the US and the world for necessary action in the field of climate change. But for this to happen, one needs a kind of political coalition, both in this country and in other countries, between the constituency, the environmental constituency and the energy security constituency, which are somewhat different in terms of political colors. When we try to forge that or work on that, there are 3 problems that we must see how they are linked together. One is enormous, and that is the must in this, climate change. I just was at the International Studies Association convention in Chicago and went to a paper on climate change where a group at Yale were working on climate change and how to mitigate it, and they considered climate change to be something they called a super wicked problem. Because you had wicked problem, but this was super wicked because you had little time, no chance to do mistakes on the way, because you had no central authority on the level needed in order to do it, and because the consequences of failure would be so enormous. The other problem is big, and that is the question of energy security, both global and national. And then there is one smaller problem which should be relatively easy to resolve in comparison with the others, and that is the political instability in the Middle East. The energy security links together the Middle East political problems with climate change. So to understand what's happened and to design strategies, we need multidisciplinary teams of researchers and policymakers, focusing on all these 3 areas and combining all the relevant research disciplines. Then comes my Asia focus, which is that the most effective investments one can make in reducing the CO2 emissions, they can be made in the least energy efficient growth countries. And that is Russia as the least energy efficient of all the major economies, China notably, perhaps the most important, to a lesser extent India, which is actually quite a lot more energy efficient for two reasons: that you still have a large primary sector and that you have a relatively large tertiary sector and not so much industry. And then the USA as the key. So these four countries are key. So then there is a key political challenge in resolving a dilemma, an ethical dilemma, which I think one could reason also ethically around, and that is the question of the conflict between the right to development of the developing countries and the fact that we absolutely need them to leapfrog the environmentally polluting stage in their development. This is the main argument that I'll take you through in a little bit more detail now. I'm starting then with climate change, which is now finally this year really on top of the global agenda. Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth did a lot to raise attention, not only in this country but throughout the world. The Stern report to the British government in October, although it has been very much criticized, also has made a major impact. The fact that climate change was the first time mentioned seriously in Bush's State of the Union address contributed. The new ambitious EU commitments to seek for a solution where you accept only a 2-degree increase in the global temperature, and that EU's contribution to this is to reduce its emissions by 20% by 2020. And then the first of 4 reports from the UN climate panel in February this year from Working Group 1. We will have the reports from the other 2 working groups in April, May, I believe, and then there will be the synthesis report. And then we have a special situation now with Germany both heading the G8 and the Council of Ministers in the EU, and Germany is a very environmentally conscious country. So it will try to drive the agenda this year, also with a special conference in May to prepare for the G8 summit in June. And we are heading up for the new negotiations for what to do after the Kyoto period in Bali from the 3rd to the 14th of December. Then one member of Henrik Syse's Conservative Party and one member of my Socialist Party have together nominated Al Gore, together with the Canadian Sheila, I don't remember her second name, who is an Inuit who has been doing much work concerning the Arctic, them together for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think they stand a good chance. And as in the world's chief guesser concerning who gets the Nobel Peace Prize, I'm going to promote this idea this year. What is then the state of the global warming threat? First, no longer any doubt that the atmosphere is heating up. Also, little doubt that global warming is caused largely by the burning of fossil fuels. Also, little doubt about the fact that this involves serious risks. But still a lot of concentration as to how serious the risks are and as to what kind of remedies there are. Is it at all possible to stop global warming, or would it be better to use the resources on mitigating the negative effects, for instance by moving people away from low-lying areas? The negotiations aiming for a new globally inclusive Kyoto Treaty, including the USA, China and India, with obligatory caps on their emissions, will gain momentum. And I think that the EU now, with its new aims, will have to also launch a very serious negotiation strategy to try to force others to go along. They've tried to do that by committing themselves to 30% emissions if others go along. And then the big problem is that the size of private and public investments in energy efficiency, renewable resources of energy, clean coal, capture of CO2, where Norway is trying to develop technologies, natural gas, carbon-free transportation and nuclear power, these investments will continue to depend on the oil price. which may well continue to fluctuate. And that moves us into the question of energy security, which was in a way similarly on top on the agenda in 2006, as climate change seems to be this year. It was the main issue at the G8 meeting in St. Petersburg, and it was discussed at a number of bilateral summits, and also at a summit, for instance, of the non-aligned movement, where India was selected as the country to take the lead in that organization's work. And that shows how also the attention in Asian countries and developing countries has now very much increased concerning this issue. But we must here distinguish between the concern for national energy security and global energy security, although many argue that the latter is the only way to ensure the first. When we look at global energy security, we cannot avoid the discussion about peak oil. We hear geologists often say that the oil reserves are limited and that we are approaching the peak when it is impossible to further increase the global production, and when no cheap substitute will be available. There would be more expensive ways of producing oil, but that would not be possible to really compete. So this would force us then to a change of our way of life. Often the geologists who are active in this area say a Western way of life is unsustainable if the big developing countries should have the same level of prosperity or even approach it. But then the economists often say that the market forces will resolve this through the market mechanism, because when the price increases, then other kinds of energy production will become competitive, and that we will simply see the investments in technological change. But the problem with this economic argument are two that are related to the Middle East. And the first is that the provision of oil from the Middle East may be interrupted by war in the Persian Gulf. And only the prospect of this is influencing the oil price. The other factor is that it's also possible that one could see changes in the other direction. And this leads me to talk of a problem that I will turn to in a moment, of also something I call the peace risk in the Middle East. If we look at the national perspective on this, the global perspective is the most important, but the national perspective is used by most governments. Then oil is the main worry, because other kinds of energy are often seen as means to reduce oil import dependency, including coal. And at the same time, we know that national self-sufficiency in oil is unattainable for most nations, including the United States. The only major economy that has something near self-sufficiency in oil is the UK. So if you see this list of the oil importing nations, main oil importing countries, you don't see the UK, but you see the biggest ones there. And China is rising towards the top. If we divide the world between the main oil importing countries and oil exporting countries, we can also create a table of alliances, political alliances, that either alliances among oil importers or alliances among oil exporters, or that cut across. And the most important partnerships among importers are the US-Japan. Japan is the country that is most dependent on oil import, because it imports everything, and it imports virtually all the oil it imports from the Middle East. China and the United States have both behaved very differently and are more diversified in their import structure. So the Japanese dependency on Middle Eastern oil is a major factor, and it is the United States, through the US-Japan alliance, that is defending Japan's access to this oil. Then NATO is also an organization mainly of oil importers, though there is a major or a small exception. And the new partnership, strategic partnership between the United States and India is also in this category. Then you have also the politically important partnerships among exporters, where of course OPEC is the most long-standing and important of them. But there is now much talk about Russia seeking alliances with other, mainly gas exporters, and there has been started to talk about the gas cartel. Among the partnerships between importers and exporters, the most important one is that between the United States and Saudi Arabia. But you also have China having engaged in similar attempts to establish bilateral direct relations with many oil exporters, both in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and in relation to countries in Africa and the Middle East. We also see in this situation of much attention to energy security that the geopolitical discussion about pipeline construction has become a major factor, both with a potential for sowing conflict and the potential for bridging relations between countries in conflict. One example there is now the project for a pipeline from Iran through Pakistan to India, which is linked to India's desire to try and resolve the Kashmir issue. And we see politically a development in the Middle East, a weakening of the United States' position in the Middle East, and more talk about an internal balance of power in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia with their respective allies. So this is in a way the geopolitical situation within which national energy security is considered. Some 60% of the world's oil reserves, as we know, are within this map. There are 5 countries in the Middle East that have 722 of the world's 1,293 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, with Saudi Arabia, of course, on top. Their oil is also much cheaper to produce than oil in most other places. But the oil sector in the Middle East suffers from underinvestment and inefficient management, much due to the fact that the national oil companies are less effective than many other oil companies. The risk that the Middle East will react to the concern for energy security and all the investments in other kinds of energy by seeking to boost their production is quite considerable. And Saudi Arabia has already done this to some extent. This, of course, is a positive factor in one way because it provides more oil to the world market and reduces energy insecurity or oil import insecurity. But at the same time, it may very well contribute to a drastic reduction in the oil price again, and then remove the momentum for doing something about the climate change. And this is what I call a peace risk. And I see this peace risk as a kind of moral dilemma, because you have to be in favor both of peace and stability in the Middle East and of doing something about the climate change. So there is an obvious conflict between these two concerns. The other risk that there could be major war is much easier to handle, because that is negative in every sense. So I ask if this peace risk represents an ethical dilemma, and I have not worked much on it yet. I don't know if it has so much consequence either, but I'm rather offering it as a question, whether we should let this go through some ethical reflections on that. Then for my political argument, it's extremely important to ask concerning the question of this coalition between the two constituencies that I talked about in the morning, in the beginning. Then we must ask if the measures we must take to enhance energy security and to stop global warming, if they are the same. And here I have 4 that are the same. That's energy conservation, energy efficiency, including a reduction in transportation needs, for instance, through more video conferences. Perhaps next time we have a PRIO event like this, we should remain in Oslo and speak to you over on the screen. Investments in renewable energy and technological innovation in power generation, carbon-free transportation, and notably carbon capture. More gas to replace use of coal and oil. All of these measures need enormous investments. And there are good energy security arguments for doing it. There are good climate change arguments for doing it. But when we get to coal, it's quite obvious that coal works in the direction of enhancing energy security on a national level, particularly for those countries that have much coal, like the United States and China. But it's the worst thing you can do concerning climate change, as long as you have not developed cost-effective clean coal technologies. With nuclear energy, we can have more of a discussion, because the dangers of nuclear energy are of another kind. Nuclear energy contributes both to national energy security and to reducing global warming, so I should perhaps have put it in the category above, but I find that very difficult. Then we have the other ethical problem that I mentioned before, this conflict between the right to development and the absolute need to reduce, put a brake on emissions and eventually reduce emissions in the big growth countries in Asia. We know that by 2009 already, China is expected to surpass the United States in terms of CO2 emissions. And this is a global problem, and China must do something about it. But of course, the counter-argument is that the CO2 emissions per inhabitant is so low still in China in relation to the United States, and that we hear both from Chinese spokespersons and often from people who say this to the Chinese in ways that may make them reduce their willingness to do something about it. I feel this as a problem. I think we must stop saying these things. We must impress on the Chinese the absolute need to do something about it, both for themselves and for the world at large. But then we must find good strategies of doing this in ways that may be acceptable to the Chinese. And the Chinese preferably should themselves become active in adopting such proactive strategies. And when we look at the strategies for doing something about climate change, there is a very clear difference between the EU strategy and the US strategy, with the EU strategy based on legally imposed treaty-based caps on the allowed emissions in each nation, and where you should then have negotiations to lower these caps and have quota trade to make the system work. And with the United States putting more emphasis on voluntary measures, non-legally binding measures, but measures that enhance and stimulate technological change and investments. These two strategies are often seen as incompatible, and one criticizes the other. In actual fact, I think they are supplementary, because the US strategy emphasizes the enhancement of the means needed to fulfill the obligations that the EU strategy tries to set. And it's this that must be the basis for the negotiations in Bali, where it's essential to get the whole world into the system that the Kyoto Protocol has established, while at the same time building on the experiences that have been built so far, but unfortunately very late, with the US strategy and the establishment of the AP6 group, or the Asia-Pacific cooperation in this area between the United States, Australia, China, Japan, South Korea, and India, where the emphasis is on these voluntary measures. The very fact that an organization of these countries that represent well over half of the world's emissions has been established in addition to the Kyoto Protocol, I see as a very positive fact. So I would not share the general criticism in Europe of this American initiative for being insufficient. It should rather be welcomed as an addition to what is being done from the European point of view. But my question is that then if perhaps China and India could enter these negotiations with a more proactive strategy and seek assistance from Japan, the EU, and the USA in a massive effort to clean up their growth. Because Japan is a member of both the Kyoto Protocol and also of the APP. So Japan, if it could have a more active diplomatic stance internationally, would have a chance to be a key actor, actually. It also has a very substantial cooperation with China technologically in energy conservation, which developed without being much damaged at all from the political difficulties between those two countries. So let me end by taking you through 6 conclusions. The first is that to stop global warming and ensure global energy security, enormous investments are needed in energy conservation and alternative energy. The figure set on it by the International Energy Agency in 2006 was $20 trillion before 2030. The second is that while most of this cost must be carried by Europe, North America, Japan, and preferably also the oil-producing countries, the countries that can afford it, and the countries that have benefited from the carbon economy for so many years, the most cost-effective investments can be made in Russia, China, and India. This is the enormous political challenge on the global level that calls for leadership. The third is that since the means to stop global warming and ensure global and national energy security are largely the same, it should be possible to forge the political alliances needed to carry out drastic action, provided that those concerned by national security do not see coal as their main remedy. You would also need to get this alliance at some stage to accept the need for carbon taxes. And preferably there should be an international treaty that would also put a minimum carbon tax, set a minimum carbon tax that every country must apply. This is actually part of the next point, number 4. This is a globally applied minimum carbon tax. That's one of the 3 measures needed. The second is a global Kyoto system with national caps on CO2 emissions and quota trade. And the third is massive investments. So then again comes my Asia focus, where the Russians, Chinese, and Indians need to overcome that tendency to argue defensively and instead adopt a proactive strategy. And the proposal I'm making to them, and I've also made that in a lecture in New Delhi, is that China and India should head for establishing global environmental investment parks in some part of their countries, where they would demand of the rich countries to carry much of the financial burden and make technology available, and also buy out patents and stimulate the most advanced companies to invest in those parks. This would lead to a more direct implementation of new technologies in the areas where they can be applied most cost efficiently. And at the same time, it would create a lobby of engineers and other experts in those 2 countries linked to these parks, and give their universities some and the research institutes, such as also Tata, for instance, in India, some major opportunities. Then my sixth conclusion is that world leaders, when they gather, for instance, for the G8 summit in June, must now get beyond just providing a list of all the things that governments need to do. They need to create institutions that can coordinate and lead the effort, preferably from the perspective of a small country. These institutions should be under the UN. But I think there is movement now in the EU towards seeing that it will be difficult to get United States commitment to a kind of institutional solution within the UN, and perhaps that creating something around the G8 is what is needed, a kind of concert of major powers around the fight against global warming. This is not perfect from the point of view of a small country that is also outside the EU, but if that is what is needed in order to get some things done, it is so much more preferable. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much. We have a lot to work with in a discussion period. I will remind you, because particularly we are webcasting the event, we ask that you use the microphone when you're posing a question. If you could let us know who you are, that would be terrific. So who would like to kick us off in terms of a question discussion period? No? Yes, please, over here. The gentleman will bring you the microphone.
Hi, I'm Jane Siegel with the Department of Commerce. I wanted to ask, is it Dr. Tonneson? Have I got that right? The mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol whereby a developed country can create an investment in a developing country and get a credit under the vision you've laid out here. Is that the right way to go or the wrong way to go?
Yes, these are the so-called CDMs, the Clean Development Mechanisms, where you can do an investment in a developing country that will lead to a reduction in emissions there, and then you can get that into your own account at home. And companies can do that. It's absolutely, I think, the right way to go, and it has started, and there are now, fortunately, quite a number of such mechanisms applied in China. But the big problem is that it's so difficult to really be sure that the reductions are being done. Because if the investments is just in a plant or something that comes in addition to what China or another country is still investing in, then it doesn't work, because China doesn't have a cap on its total emissions. So it must be combined with a globally applied system of caps.
Okay, I have a question for Henrik. How much or how little are you in your, well, either wearing either hat, kind of a PRIO outsider's role or inside with the bank, and or people in Norway, how much are you talking to other countries that are having more difficulty with the resource curse, and or the intermediate institutions such as the World Bank that may be trying to set up mechanisms for dealing with it? I'm thinking, of course, of the Chad with the Chad-Cameroon pipeline and some of the funds that have been tried there in terms of constricting how the money is spent. Obviously, many of those countries are in a very different place than Norway developmentally in terms of GDP and the wealth and the income of their populations. But are there mechanisms for learning from the models that you've developed?
It's a good question, and the answer is yes. We do get an enormous amount of questions internationally, both directed to the investment management and directed to the finance ministry, which basically start with, how do you do this? And I think a key part of the answer is exactly what you said. We are in a different place. Remember when the first influx came into this fund in 1996? Look at the state of the Norwegian economy and Norwegian welfare state and Norwegian infrastructure in 1996. This is a country that is pretty much, it's me doing that, it's a special trick I have. It's a sort of infrastructure that can take these sorts of reserves being set aside, which is very different from countries that need these resources now for actually developing any sort of basic welfare system. Having said that, the resource curse still applies, and not least because of corruption. We see that a number of the most resource-rich countries move into curses that are basically connected to the money disappearing, to the investments disappearing. And that is also something that we're having a useful international exchange on, where Norway and the Petroleum Fund, or Pension Fund as it's now called, has taken active part in something called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which comes out of something called Publish What You Pay. Basically that you need to see the money streams. We need to insist from the companies that we own that when you pay money into this country, we will see where it goes, because it essentially should not disappear. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do in the international discussion about how to take care of natural resources. I don't think it's essentially just duplicating the petroleum fund that's the answer.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Robert Mertz, consultant, used to be with the World Bank. Norway has taken a rather remarkably leadership role on trying to bring about peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And in this country, there has been a lot of discussion among various churches about what to do about disinvestment following what is considered to be a success in pressuring for a change in racial relations in South Africa, trying to use investment in companies in this country and in other countries for the same purposes, and trying to bring about both a decrease in the military occupation of the Israelis and Palestinian areas, but also to bring about movement toward peace. Given Norway's long-standing political involvement and leadership in that issue, I wondered to what extent the NBIM has taken that into account in its strategy. You didn't mention it, and you didn't mention generally the political dimension either.
True. It's quite true that I did not mention the political dimension because we do leave that to the politicians, our owners. So they would have to be the one making a decision, for instance, to join international boycotts of various regimes. There is today no such boycott of Israeli products. It's interesting because our finance minister, who is our principal, comes from a party that has as part of its party program to have a selective boycott of Israeli products. That is not Norwegian policy as of today. It also, of course, leads into a huge discussion, which many of my colleagues at PRIO had done extensive work on whether such sanctions actually work, whether they can be made smarter, as the idiom puts it, and whether they actually contribute to change, whether South Africa is actually a good example or not. Maybe Stein wants to say a few more words on that issue.
Norway does not see itself as really had played a role of leadership, but it did facilitation of the process between the parties. And that has not been possible to pursue very much recently. But there is still a kind of preparedness for playing a role, and also continue to spend money on the Palestinian Authority. I understand this was also discussed between our foreign minister and the Secretary of State during his recent visit, where there has been some disagreement concerning the way the adoption of policy towards Hamas and Hamas participation in the government. But the spending of money on what could be a two-state solution is something Norway is clearly prepared for. But to go in with boycotts or anything, that is, I think, excluded.
Okay. Is there a question over here? Yes, please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Nahala Ivy with ESG Analytics of Institutional Shareholder Services in Rockville, Maryland. We provide research for investment managers on corporate governance and sustainability issues. A couple questions for Dr. Seiss would be, first, are you looking for, you mentioned the potential for actively engaging regarding ESG as part of the input on your investment decision making. Are you looking for, at this point, more of the connection between financial performance and sustainability issues as in terms of corporate approach to sustainability before deciding on active engagement? And the other question would be, have you considered in the past, or maybe have taken action in the past through proxy voting through shareholder proposals on targeted companies versus the broad approach which you mentioned?
It's good to have ISS here. We are a proud and happy customer of the ISS services. And for those of you who don't know it, well, you can imagine, try to vote to 3,500 companies with 26,500 different items up. Then you need someone to help you sort it. And today the leading firm in doing so is ISS. Yes, we are looking for those things that combine corporate strategy and sustainability. And while it may seem obvious, shouldn't everyone be talking about that? It is a very real problem that in most investor-company dialogue, there are very much shorter terms that we are speaking on. We're very often talking about what happens in the company over the next 4 to 6 weeks. So actually finding ways of speaking to companies, of finding those issues that the board of directors will be willing to integrate into their strategies, and finding those things that create shareholder value, or rather that combine shareholder value with these longer-term sustainability issues, is a real challenge. It's not just a rhetorical challenge; it's a substantial challenge, and that's one of the sorts of research that yes, we are looking for, and which is 10 years ago it almost wasn't there at all. So that is something that is developing. Will it have a direct impact on the sort of investments we have? Well, as of today, that's not the way our pension fund works. That's left to the politicians to actually make the sort of direct investments that Stein talks about, for instance. We are there to maximize the returns. Of course, they should be long-term. We should include sustainability, but we're not being used as a political tool. So, but I think we could increasingly go there where these issues will also influence where we actually invest. That these will be investment decisions based on this information. But right now they are influencing the corporate governance, the active ownership strategy. To the second one, yes, obviously shareholder proposals, which are a big thing in the United States, not used that much in the rest of the world, interestingly, will be something we will be using to voice our opinion. And I think if you, after a long-term engagement, long-term meaning maybe 2 years with a company, you're getting nowhere, and as a huge investor such as NBIM goes out there and actually puts a shareholder proposal before the company, that could have real effect and, basically scare them to do something.
Okay. Rich Sinkata, and I think this will have to be our last question.
Rich Sinkata, and I work for the Long Range Analysis Unit of the National Intelligence Council. Stein, there were two issues, I think, thorny issues that you didn't mention. And one was population growth, particularly in Asia and then later in Africa, but particularly in North India, because North India is growing economically, but its more wealthy section actually has higher fertility rates than its poor southern area. Secondly, the issue that has been reported several times that when Middle East oil producers see the U.S. in particular start to shift toward other more renewable sources of energy, they drop the oil price, thus making it very difficult for the U.S. to actually move into those arenas.
Yes, the population growth is true. I didn't mention that. I'll take that to mind. I noticed also at the convention in Chicago, at the panel I went to there was noticed that in environmental studies and also among demographers, there is not much talk any longer about the danger from population growth, which was very dominating a few decades ago. The other point I tried to make, that was what I saw as this peace risk. It's not necessarily so that you need peace to do it either, because Saudi Arabia could do it alone. But today, Iraq and Iran cannot easily do it at all because of the political situation. But if you stabilize those countries, it would be possible for them to also reduce the oil price by producing more oil. But what Saudi Arabia has already done now has boosted the oil production in Saudi Arabia and may lead to a drop in the oil price next year. And I fear that because it could take away the momentum that we currently see to combat global warming.
Terrific. Well, thanks for some excellent